This conference
covering
will
a little
now be
more
recorded.
covering a little more detail the multi-line telephone system, or MLTS, and talk a little bit about liabilities and best practices. So to start off, the RAY BAUM Act is really looking at getting all the technologies that are out there to have automatic dispatchable locations. So wireless rules were set several years ago to increase location accuracies, but there's not much being done with other technologies such as VoIP and TRS. So this is trying to pull them all together to all get better location accuracy than there is today. So, and then the RAY BAUM Act sets the due dates for having all these procedures implemented. So the problem that RAY BAUM is trying to fix is that different technologies have different requirements and actually different capabilities. So CMRS can give you the X, Y, and Z coordinate locations within 200 feet. And it was approximately 2015 when some of those came out, and different types of CMRS carriers had to comply based on their size and what the capability of the PSAPs were. For wireline, since E911 came up, essentially wireline does have an automatic dispatchable location, which is based on a valid street address, and that street address has requirements for it that are set in the MSAG that is set by either the state or the county. Sometimes the telephone companies put together that street address guide. But it has valid street addresses in it so that you're not putting erroneous addresses in. VoIP, because VoIP initially started out saying, hey, VoIP is all nomadic and you can't tell where the calls are coming from. They set up a centralized location in each state to send 911 calls, and there really was no actual dispatchable location that came along with that. That technology is getting better, so that's addressed in RAY BAUM's Act. Text is another area that's coming up, again, a little more associated with CMRS, but it may be able to be accepted by the 911, but there's no location with it generally today. So they wanted to include text and also TRS service in the new requirements. And for non-fixed locations, you get a lot more problems on trying to get an accurate automatic address coming along with the call. So, initially they were trying to use web addresses, but those web addresses change a lot, so it's hard to keep up with them. Some IP information, say on your cell phone, may only be available if you allow your location to be known. And if you block that device, then again, the 911 location is not going to get it based on what the end user preferences are. And relying on customer input for VoIP service to say, hey, I moved my VoIP phone and I have to update the database when I move it, everybody knows is not very accurate, because end users just are not thinking about putting 911 addresses in every time they move their location. So we're trying to fix a lot of those problems. So, when we're talking about a dispatchable location, what does that mean? So a dispatchable location is a location delivered to the PSAP with a 911 call that consists of a valid street address, of the calling party, plus additional information such as the suite number, apartment number, or similar information necessary to adequately identify the location of the calling party, except for the CMRS provider. So the CMRS has a little bit different dispatchable location, which is essentially the V&H coordinates. So the new thing here is that plus additional information, because we've had the street addresses for a long time, but not the additional information. So we do have options to provide that, with some technologies, and some technologies won't be able to do this. So the additional information can be that XYZ location, the building suite, or a zone, because we are addressing multi-line telephone systems here. Information on the device that can actually output information as to where you are, or it can be the best available location based on the technology available. So the FCC order does allow all of these things based on what type of technology you're actually using. For the implementation dates, essentially, we're working on really two different dates. For fixed location, it's going to be 1 year after the effective date of the order, which was in 2020. So January 6, 2021 is the date for all the fixed technologies. So that's not only wireline, but it's also fixed VoIP and fixed TRS. And for those who don't know, TRS is Telecommunications Relay Service. So, that's coming up in just a couple months. So we need to prepare and make sure that you're going to be consistent with the rules. So you do have to provide the registered location on the information, which is at minimum the valid street address of the customer, prior to the initiation of the service. So again, as I mentioned, the MSAG, that would be, essentially what most wireline companies are doing today, that they have a valid street address, in the proper format that the 911 database can accept and the PSAP is going to be able to understand. But the additional information is not necessarily in there. Apartment number or unit number, a floor location, also the actual station number. If there's an extension in a multi-line telephone system, that should be passed along, and also a room and number within the building, or the XYZ coordinates, depending on what type of service you have. The XYZ coordinates, maybe more with a fixed VoIP carrier than a regular wireline customer. Non-fixed implementation has another year, so they're January 6, 2022 to implement the non-fixed, just that there's more things to work out on how they're going to get the information in automatically. Some of these are coming maybe at a later time during the call today, and there's a lot of new technologies out that can start tracking mobile services or nomadic services. And so the FCC did not want to limit what the actual solutions were, so that they can take into consideration the evolving technologies. So again, it requires the automatic dispatchable location, which should be at minimum the registered location, which was taken at the time the order comes in. So if you're like fixed VoIP, you do have a location that they registered to start with, and a lot of times the customer has to update that. But so you're going to have something that prompts them to re-register if the device is moved. And again, that's been since 2005 that requirement, has been in. But they do want these alternative locations, which are, device-based, that if my VoIP phone, when moved, automatically sends out an XYZ location, that's going to give a much better dispatchable location to the PSAP. Now, the PSAP is also going to have to be able to identify what that, GPS XYZ location is, and that's something that you're going to have to check on. There's also location based on where you are in the IP network that is done, and there's companies like Bandwidth and some of the other IP networks that provide 911. Some of them it's integrated into their IP network service. Others you can use your own IP network, but buy that 911 routing and location separately from the vendor. And again, there's other emerging technologies that are coming up, and they are not excluded from use to meet the RAY BAUM Act requirements. The default is to route the call to a centralized location in the state for the nomadic VoIP and nomadic TRS. However, you do have to show that you've made a good effort to use one of these other methods prior to using, just using that state default. You're going to have to justify why you're sending calls there, without location information. And hopefully that's only in extreme circumstances that you would have to do that. The room and floor location is encouraged for the non-fixed but not required due to the technical and cost feasibility. Now, that is something that's in the federal requirement. When I looked at the Michigan rules, they have a lot on what the multi-line telephone systems have to do, and they don't really distinguish between a landline-based service and any VoIP non-fixed service. So that's something you're going to have to work a little bit on. How do I meet both the Michigan rules and the FCC rules? On the FCC, I'm going to do a little bit on MLTS, since that's a little different to walk through and has more dependence on what the actual customer is going to do. Now, you will have some requirements if you are also selling the PBX or hosted PBX to the end user. Some of these locations the end user is going to have to give you, but if you're also the operator of that service, you have some more responsibilities to ensure that you're helping to educate the customer and help them identify how do we show you're in this zone of the building or that zone of the building, or if it's a campus environment, how do you get the different buildings identified into the database or with your automatic location. On the MLTS, the date for the FCC rules for the MLTS was February 16th, 2020. However, in the Michigan rules, the location accuracy is January 1st, 2020. So since the Michigan rules are an earlier date, for your perspective, you should be looking at any system that was installed prior to January 1st, 2020 as the ones that would have to comply with the location rules. The older systems, the FCC wants to include additional information if technically feasible, and when they're upgraded, they would have to comply with all these new rules. So again, you have a valid street address with additional information, but as mentioned earlier, you want the station numbers to pass through because you can have many more customers or stations that are not 10-digit dialed numbers. And you do want the floor, room, and zone of the building to go along with those. Now, in the Michigan rules, they require accurate automatic location information and automatic number location that can be verified, the 911 location database to be included with a specific communications device. So I have read the rules. I don't know how the MSAG or the database has been updated to include that specific location, but hopefully your 911 database provider has given you that information. And if not, that is something you should be looking into so that you're complying with the formats and everything with your database provider. On implementing RAY BAUM Act, we have seen that at least in Trado, or what I forget what Trado's new name, but they're only allowing 20 characters for the additional information. So you only have a short amount of space to add that information. The FCC compliance date for non-fixed is the 2-year time frame, again, January 6th, and that's for all the MLTS. So again, MLTS is following the same dates. For the fixed is the same 1 year for so 2021, and the non-fixed locations, which could be, you know, a hosted PBX that move, or off-prem stations, you know, have the later nomadic date of 2022. So again, here, the MLTS operator manager must provide the dispatchable location if technically feasible, and either manually updated or using one of the best available locations that you can get. So if you're using XYZ coordinates or the IP address, it's going to be typically the same items that options that are for, you know, any kind of nomadic VoIP service that would also be for MLTS. So just a little bit on the legal matters. You know, what happens if you don't comply? You know, violations are reported to Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau's center and the FCC's consumer, and they have complaints under Part 1, Subpart E of the rules. So anybody can report problems with 911, and there can be fines if you're found to be in non-compliance. The FCC recently seems to be cracking down on some of the 911 issues. So even for 911 reliability, we had several clients get fined for not, you know, filing their compliance on the reliability over the last year. So we expect that as RAY BAUM Act gets implemented, that the FCC will be looking to do audits on companies that have complaints. So you don't want to end up in that type of area. So on state rules, the FCC said, you know, we don't see any state rules that are inconsistent with the federal rules. And nobody has raised that, so they did not address any conflicts between the two. When I looked at the Michigan rules, they do not seem to conflict. I mean, the date's a little bit different, but it seems pretty consistent with the FCC rules that based on the size of the company, you have to do different levels of detail on providing the address and the location information. And that does not seem to be inconsistent at all with the FCC rules. So what are the best practices? How are you going to, start to implement this that you as a telephone provider are sometimes in between the customer, especially on MLTS, that has to identify the locations in your building, and what the PSAP wants and what is useful to the PSAP. So we recommend that first you work with a local PSAP on information that's helpful to the responders. What's going to work out well. Is some of this with the some of the Carey's Law items, and where does that sit? Emphasize with your customers, register your locations when CPE is moved, emphasize that the zones will be very helpful to the customers, and emphasize that the locations have to be reviewed and updated often. Also validate that your current 911s have accurate addresses. You may want to bounce them off, the current MSAG to verify that you do have that information, and also are having the additional room number and floor number as required by the Michigan law. And then test your system to make sure the system is flowing through so the PSAP is actually getting the information. If you do need help, we do have a checklist to implement it. We've been talking to some of the IP providers on what they provide, and can help you out with some of those, because it may be that they're responsible for doing some of this, or you're really subcontracting with them, and we can help you with education materials, both internally and with your customers. So with that, I can take questions.
Val, this is Mike Holmes. For wireline providers, is that are looking for technology, is this something that they should go to their current switch vendor, or is this an application or overlay technology to deploy the location information, the additional information, that they can get that technology from somebody else?
So if you're talking on wireline technology, I mean, since it's fixed, that's really you getting the street address from the customer. For VoIP, that's where you get into the technology options. Even if it's fixed, some of the CPE can be self-discovered, and the addresses put in from that, or X, Y, and Z coordinate. I'm trying to not say V&H, because they do want the height also, not just the V&H. So that would, as you said, could come through your switch vendor, on what that can do, what they can do on, recognizing the CPE and where it's located. But there's also companies like bandwidth.com who offers a standalone VoIP 911 service, so that the calls are actually routed to bandwidth, and bandwidth figures out what the proper PSAP is to terminate the call to. So that really bypasses your wireline, say 911 tandem, that would bypass that network, and it would be a different network that those VoIP calls are going on. And bandwidth is not the only one. I think there's 2 or 3 VoIP 911 carriers. Any other questions? Does everybody know how much information you can put in the additional field when you're getting information from the customer to do your MLTS customers with the additional information. Is there another question here? I see somebody unmuted.
Oh, this is Kelly. That was me.
Oh.
I have a question. This is Amy within Digital Telecom. It seems like for the mobile applications, the PSAP would be getting the location data from their SSP. I'm talking legacy, not next generation, but they would be getting their location data from through an E2 link somehow. So it seems like the critical point there is making sure that everybody's on board with what fields that information would be stored in and making sure that gets displayed at the PSAP. So you were saying Intrado/West that they only allow 20 characters, and I'm assuming they're using the location field for that. Do you have anything more to say about?
You should work with your PSAP in the actual, if you're going through a 911 tandem like West, validate one where the database will allow you to put the information, and also where the PSAP is looking for the information. That some clients, even before the RAY BAUM Act, have put additional information in, but the PSAP wanted to see it in different standard fields. So you might have one PSAP that has designated XYZ field for the additional information, and another PSAP that put it in a different field in the standard 911 address input.
So it sounds like there's not really it's not very standard except for the location field, which has been used for years and years. But beyond that, it's a pretty figure it out in that locality kind of issue.
Yes, and Amanda Molina is on too. Amanda, do you want to address that in a little more detail? Amanda, are you on mute?
Hey, sorry about that. I apologize. I just unmuted my phone, not the portal. So we have been working with a few other clients that actually, fortunately or unfortunately, connect to multiple PSAPs. And so in one case, there's actually 3 different ones, and there are 3 different ways that they're passing along that data. And unfortunately, it isn't always going to be in that location field. So one thing, too, that we've kind of focused on, and I know today was primarily talking about RAY BAUM, but in conjunction with that, you have obligations under Kerry's law. So one of the things that we have been recommending to folks is under Kerry's law, you have that simultaneous notification requirement, and you can fit a lot more data in there. And so we've been kind of stressing that, while you may be limited in what you can get to the PSAP as far as additions in the address line, or, again, that 20 character, including spaces, location field, you do have kind of that other avenue that's going to work in conjunction when a 911 call is placed. So while those fields to the PSAP are confining and very limited, you do kind of have that other avenue to create the whole picture.
Any other questions?
Well, this is Kelly. I'd like to say thank you, Valerie, for the presentation today. We really appreciate you doing that for us.
Okay, well, thank you. And if anybody has any calls, our number is there on the slide. Give Amanda or I a call, and hopefully we can help you work through this.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.